In May of 1944, Ray Elsmor was flying over the center of New Guinea when he stumbled upon something that left him speechless. Surrounded by jagged mountains was a hidden valley filled with large structures and gardens teeming with sweet potato, taro, and tobacco. Unknowingly, he had stumbled upon thousands of people who had never come into contact with the outside world. It was easy to see why. The only entrance was a river on the south end which cascaded over a cliff, and flying through the valley itself was dangerous due to the heavy clouds and mountains surrounding the area. The terrain made it impossible to land an aircraft, but the pictures and stories of the hidden valley and its occupants would make their way back to the Allied troops stationed on the island country. Depending on who you asked, they would either tell you this valley was home to a tall, beautiful super race, or filled with cannibals and headhunters performing human sacrifices. If someone was desperate enough to find out for themselves, they would need to trek over 240 kilometers through mountains, swamps, and lakes littered with Japanese soldiers. But even with the distance, a number of military planes would fly over the village, some of which only doing so as a form of sightseeing to entertain the Allied troops. But this would all come to an end on May 13th, 1945, when a plane full of American soldiers would crash in the valley while trying to see the village. Instead of observing the villagers safely from the sky, they would find themselves injured and surrounded by them for over a month. What's even more interesting about this story is that there are accounts from those who were children in these villages, which gives a small insight into what their parents thought when confronted with these completely alien people. This is the story of the Shangri-La crash. In January of 1944, Margaret Hastings signed up for the Women's Army Corps and soon found herself sent to Dutch New Guinea. Her arrival would come shortly after Operation Reckless, a joint US and Australian engagement which killed over 3,000 Japanese troops and forced them to withdraw further west. Despite being marginally safer, morale on the island was hard to maintain. The rainforest was humid, wet, full of mosquitoes, and teeming with diseases, snakes, and spiders. Attempting to boost morale, Colonel Peter Prosson started organising flights up the coastline of New Guinea, namely to Shangri-La, a place he knew would excite his troops. On May 13th, 1945, the troops rushed to complete their jobs and finish any late Mother's Day letters. By 2 p.m, a line of excited troops formed outside the C-47 Gremlin Special. In total, 19 passengers and 5 aircrew would enter the plane ready for their 3-hour trip into the valley. Before long, they would approach their location, and this is where things would go horribly wrong. With the village coming into view, the pilot, Peter Prosson, unbuckled his seatbelt and left the cockpit with the intention to bomb with his staff as they flew over the village. In doing so, he left his co-pilot Major George Nicholson to deal with entering the valley through its clouded mountain passage. This was the most dangerous part of the flight, and something Ray Elsmor, the man responsible for discovering Shangri-La, had warned people about. While those in the cockpit unbuckled their seatbelts to socialize and get closer to the windows, George Nicholson was struggling to gain altitude and flying low to the ground. Soon the plane was smacking and scraping trees, and by this time Peter would have been aware something had gone wrong, but could do nothing about it. Just after 3 p.m, the Gremlin Special collided with a mountain on an upward angle. The angle of the crash is important to note, because this would stop the plane from exploding on impact, but would do nothing to stop the collision. In seconds, those inside the plane were bounced around inside the cabin as the wings and tail were ripped away from the plane, and the cockpit crumpled forward. Lieutenant John McComb, who had boarded the flight with his twin brother, was flung across the center aisle and knocked unconscious. Corporal Margaret Hastings, who had been thrown around in a similar way, would open her eyes to find herself laying atop one of the dead passengers. Their body had acted as a cushion, saving her from the impact, but their arms were still wrapped around her tightly. The smell of oil and burning flesh was overwhelming, and the fire was quickly spreading. Desperate to escape, Margaret struggled to pry herself out of the dead man's grip before crawling out of the wreckage. When she reached the jungle floor, John McComb, who had escaped minutes earlier, would call to her. Before Margaret could answer, she was interrupted by a blood-curdling scream. The plane was beginning to burn faster, but inside was a woman begging for help. Acting quickly, John inched his way back inside the plane and pulled out Laura Besley before going back a second time to retrieve Eleanor Henner, who had been sitting next to Laura. John turned back toward the plane for a third time, only to realize he wouldn't be able to save anyone else. The plane was now completely engulfed in flames, and any hope for those still inside, including his twin brother, was now gone. It would seem to those outside watching the plane burn that they would be the only survivors. until Sergeant Kenneth Decker stumbled from behind the wreckage towards them. A wide gash ran across his forehead, revealing bone, and his elbow was visibly broken. Kenneth had no memory of what had occurred after the crash, and when asked, only muttered, "It was a hell of a way to spend his birthday." Though concerned he was speaking nonsense as a result of his injuries, it was actually Kenneth's birthday. John, who somehow came out of the crash virtually unharmed, took command and ordered Margaret, who was frozen in shock, to attend to Laura and Eleanor. While Eleanor's face hadn't been harmed, her clothes had been seared off, revealing burns which covered her body. Laura, who had no visible injuries other than some minor burns, writhed in pain next to her. In the moment, all Margaret could really do was comfort the two in their agony, while she also dealt with the burns she had sustained to her legs. As this was happening, John would hear someone yell out from the right side of the plane and run around the wreckage to find his friend, Captain Herbert Good, lying on the ground. Seeing his friend brought on a tinge of guilt. Just that afternoon, John had invited him on the plane to see the valley. Luckily, from a distance, Herbert didn't look to be injured, and John called to him, but to John's surprise, Herbert didn't move. With Kenneth behind him, John edged closer to Herbert, but was stopped by a sudden explosion. The plane's fuel tanks erupted, spewing flames in Herbert's direction, and when the two were finally able to reach him, they realized why he hadn't moved. Herbert's foot had been tangled in the roots of a tree, and they had been too late to save him. With the fire spreading, the remaining 5 survivors moved down through the jungle-covered mountain and to a safe distance away from the wreckage. It would be while moving through the mud, rocks, and tree roots, Margaret would realize she had no shoes. When they made it to the mountain's edge, they ripped pieces of their clothing to create bandages and rested for a brief time. As rain began to fall and temperatures started to drop, the realization of their next challenge started to sink in. They had survived the plane crash, but now they needed to survive the rainforest. John and Kenneth decided they needed to return to the plane's wreckage, hoping to salvage any supplies they could find. When they arrived, the plane's cabin was still burning, and any supplies in it were likely ash, but luckily, the tail of the plane, which had been ripped off on impact, was out of the fire's reach. Climbing inside, they found a life raft, some tarps, bandages, small tins of water, and morphine. When they returned, Eleanor was given the morphine, and the rest of the supplies were shared around as the group settled in for their first night in the middle of the rainforest. During this first night, they would hear the occasional hope-inducing sounds of planes searching above, but the feeling would be short-lived. A strange sound echoed in the darkness, something which resembled the barking of wild dogs, but still sounded strangely human. The next morning, John awoke to find Eleanor had died from her injuries during the night. With no tools for a proper burial, John wrapped Eleanor in a tarp and rested her body at the base of a tree. His thoughts turned to Laura, who had not stopped shaking since the crash. As she continued to cry out in pain, John feared she had sustained internal injuries and wondered if she would also pass away while the rest of the group slept. Leaving her with Margaret, John and Kenneth returned to the wreckage and gathered more supplies from the tail of the plane. The hope they would be rescued was something they clung to despite understanding they were almost invisible under the trees looming over them. At the very least, the smoke from the wreckage would act as a signal. It was John's plan to wait for the others to regain enough strength to climb to a clearing he had seen in the mountain where they would hopefully be spotted. On the second night, Margaret and Laura shared a tarp for warmth. As they tried to sleep, Laura continued to writhe in pain, and John got up to give her morphine before going back to sleep. The next morning, Margaret would wake up next to Laura's still body. Checking her pulse, she found Laura had passed away during the night. 21 of the 24 aboard the Gremlin Special were now dead, and many mothers would soon receive a Mother's Day card from children they would never see again. With 2 of their friends now dead, and the fear of impending infection from their burns, it was decided they would not wait to get their strength, and instead head for the clearing as soon as possible. Before leaving, John gathered what supplies they had left and returned to Laura's body. Unwrapping the tarp, he removed the flight suit they had found in the plane's tail and given to her. When he got back, he handed it to Margaret. She knew it was from the body of her friend, but if she didn't want to meet the same fate, she would need the fabric to protect her burns from becoming infected. The group then set off past the wreckage and crossed a waterfall before coming to a riverbed. The jungle surrounding them was too thick to walk through, so they continued through the river. With their minds occupied with traversing the jungle, they would be confronted with another terrifying piece of reality. They were not alone. In the bank of the river was a human footprint. As the sun began to set, and with no other option, they camped along the river, and again would hear the sounds of yapping and barking echoing in the darkness. The next morning, Margaret awoke in unbearable pain, and found the burns covering her legs had become infected. This infection meant the risk of gangrene was drawing closer, but with no other options, all three continued forward until eventually reaching the clearing. The sun was finally fully visible, no longer obscured by trees, and in their time waiting there, they would see a plane pass over them. But while nursing her wounds in this clearing, Margaret would come to a gut-wrenching conclusion. The clearing they had worked so hard to get to was not a natural occurrence. The area had been cleared of its trees by people for a reason, and all they could do was sit and wait in the hope they would be rescued before they came into contact with the people who cleared it. But not long after coming to this conclusion, the yapping and barking sounds they had heard at night returned, only this time it was not an echo in the distance, but rather something that was approaching them, and as it got closer, it was apparent that these sounds were definitely being made by people. Between the three of them, they had a pocket knife, severe burns, and a bloodied head wound. In moments, the yapping was right on top of them, but despite what they were hearing, they couldn't see a single person, until finally, the bushes rustled, and out of the green jungle, dozens of native men entered the clearing. The men were covered in pig grease and holding spears and axes made from wood and sharpened stone. These people were the Yali of the Uwambo. Stories of cannibals and headhunters raced through the group's mind, but what we know from Helena Wandick, a child in the village at the time, is these stories were true, but did not paint the whole picture. New Guinea was home to over 300 different tribes with different practices. The Yali people only ate the severed hands of their enemies, and looked down upon those such as the Lendikma for eating the entire body of their slain foes. But partly cannibal or not, the men in front of the group were warriors who did not have trouble killing to protect their people. But there was something the group had that worked to their advantage. While many of the tribes had come into contact with Westerners, the Yali people, and many of the surrounding tribes this deep in the jungle, hadn't, and this would play a big part in their survival. The sounds would stop as the natives drew closer, and John ordered Margaret and Kenneth to stand and smile. Whispers spread amongst the crowd, and before long, an older man appeared from it. As the groups watched each other, the older man, who looked to be the leader, gestured for them to come closer. John urged Margaret and Kenneth to join him in walking toward the man, but Margaret, too injured to walk, stayed put. Both cautious of the other, John and the elderly man edged closer to each other, before finally meeting in the middle of the two groups. John extended his hand, and the man grasped it. The two exchanged smiles, the tension broke, and the man shook Kenneth and Margaret's hands. Unable to communicate, John would name this man Pete, but the man in front of them was Wimiyuk Wandick, a leader who only a few days before had been told by one of his people of the crash site. The plains were not new to Yali people. They had been flying over them regularly since the valley's discovery, but the presence of their white counterparts was something they hadn't seen yet. Wimiyuk's name translated loosely in English to fearful of war, but he had been in many battles, even losing his brother during one. Wimiyuk would tell his fifth son he approached the white people peacefully because he believed them to be spirits of local legend. Their return was to mark the end of an era, and Wimiyuk hoped the end would bring prosperity for his people. While the Yali might have been isolated from the world, they were far from isolated from other tribes in their region. They were traders who regularly walked great distance to exchange pigs, shells, tobaccos, bows and arrows. Upon seeing these three survivors, he was determined to befriend these spirits. As more handshakes were exchanged, a fire was started, and soon the Yali were cooking sweet potato. But the newfound friendship was not popular with everyone. One man would begin yelling and protesting Wimiyuk's interaction. John believed they may have trampled his crops, but the child of a warrior present at the time would recount the events with a different perspective. The man was more afraid than angry. He believed bad things would come from interacting with the spirits and was trying to warn others not to approach them. But no matter how much he protested, it would not stop the Yali, who had become enamored with Margaret's mirror and their first look at their reflections. By night, the villagers left the survivors where they had found them. Something funny to note is after their first meeting, Margaret and Wimiyuk would unknowingly agree on something. In her diary, Margaret would write about how badly the Yali smelled, and Wimiyuk would return to his village with a tale of the bad-smelling spirits he had met. On one side you had people covered in pig grease and ash, and on the other were people with oozing sores and infected burns. But despite how each side felt about the other's odour, Wimiyuk was genuinely worried about their well-being. So worried, in fact, the group would wake in the night to see Wimiyuk watching over them. On Thursday the 17th of May, the survivors would receive reassurance that the military was planning their rescue when a C-47 flew overhead, dropping supply crates down into the valley. Sadly, these supplies would not come without cost to the Yali people. One would crash through the roof of one of their homes, and the other would cause a casualty. A young Yali girl entering womanhood had received her first pig, a possession of great value and importance. Before the rumblings of the plane overhead were heard, she tied it to a stake outside of her home. As the supply crate dropped, the pig, who had nowhere to run, was crushed into pieces under the weight of the falling crate. This was something even 65 years later, the woman would not forgive. With anger, she would tell translators she did not receive a new pig, let alone an apology for the cause of its death. But despite the damage at the time, the people remained friendly, and the survivors retrieved supplies essential for their survival, as well as something of equal importance to them, a two-way radio. They finally had contact with the outside world, but Kenneth and Margaret's injuries were only getting worse. Though his pants were completely intact, the back of Kenneth's legs were covered in burns, which now showed signs of gangrene, and the deep gash on his forehead continued to ooze pus. Margaret's burned legs and hand now smelled of rotting flesh, and the yellow infection had started to turn black. John did what he could to treat the wounds, but days continued to pass without real medical help, and the concern they would die from their wounds was becoming more real. Despite the military knowing they were there, it wasn't as simple as flying a plane down to retrieve them. The valley's terrain was too rugged for a plane to land, and the air too thin for a helicopter to operate in. The rescue they hoped for would come from paratroopers, medics, and a long journey through the valley to a place where they could be taken by plane. The next morning, 7 days after the crash, the radio would inform them help was only 45 minutes away. The survivors would watch as a plane flew by and 2 parachutes drifted down from the sky. Having spent so much time in the jungle, the survivors were aware that even hiking 2 kilometers in the terrain would take much longer than the 45-minute estimate. In the air, struggling against the wind, medic Rami Ramirez and Dr. Ben Bellato landed off course. But this would be the least of their concerns. The moment they hit the ground, the 2 men found themselves surrounded by natives wielding spears and axes. Ramirez clamored for his rifle, ready for conflict, when a man stepped out from the crowd. It would be Wimiyuk who greeted the medics, and with the use of body language, the medics were able to communicate that they were there to help the crash survivors. Wimiyuk would nod, call over a group of boys, and instruct them to lead the medics back to the survivors. Seeing the 2 men emerge from the jungle, Margaret burst into tears. With them, the men brought coffee, bacon, and chocolate. The first night would be pleasant, but the morning would be much more painful. Kenneth's burns were doused in peroxide and antibacterial powder. His head wound would be pushed into place and stitched, and his elbow, which they were unsure if it was broken, was put into a splint. Then it was onto Margaret's leg wounds. The bandages had stuck like glue to the weeping burns, forcing the medics to rip them off before they could even look at them. When they finished peeling off the bandages, they found gangrene had set in. The severity of the injuries would mean Rami and Ben would need to spend day after day cutting off the rotting flesh and washing away what remained with peroxide. In the best case scenario, the gangrene would subside and Margaret's legs would heal. In the worst, Margaret's legs would need to be amputated, or she would die. With the medics on the ground, the military ordered Earl Walter and 7 other paratroopers to land in the area. Their task, to set up a base camp in the main valley, make it through the jungle to retrieve the survivors, and head back to their new camp for further instructions. The plan required 3 soldiers to be left behind at the paratroopers' base camp, where they would clear trees, mud, and quicksand in order to create a landing strip. If all was successful, they could avoid having to trek 240 kilometers back to civilization. On Sunday the 20th, Earl Walter and his paratroopers dropped from a low-flying plane landing 50 kilometers from the survivors' location. By dropping from a low distance, they hoped to avoid a long descent where the native people would have ample time to notice them falling. But despite their efforts, before the parachutes even hit the ground, around 200 tribesmen descended on their location. They were surrounded before they knew it, and found themselves facing down a small army wielding spears and bows. But this time, they wouldn't have Wimiyuk to save them. The paratroopers readied their rifles while the surrounding armies stood rubbing their spears together to create a frightening sound. Unknowingly, Earl and his men had landed in the northwest of the Shangri-La Valley, and directly in the middle of a no-man's land designated specifically as a battlefield between two warring Dani tribes. These two clans, the Logo Maple and the Kurulu, were a far distance away from the welcoming Yali people, with an entirely different heritage and culture. Whether for better or worse, they had no knowledge of the Gremlin's crash, but had become accustomed to the planes which continued to fly over them. A boy of the Logo Maple tribe who was present at the time would say they believed the paratroopers had descended down from a vine in the sky. Some believed Earl and his men to be spirits, but many others believed them to be warriors escaping the massacre of their people. They came to this conclusion not only because the men were wielding weapons, but the clothes, something they had never seen before, were a brown colour. In their tribe, when mourning death, they would cover themselves in mud, and to the tribe, what these men were wearing in their minds was surely made of mud. Their leader, Yali Logo, approached and studied the men who had fallen from the sky. If nothing else, he determined they were not from the rival tribe and did not need to be killed immediately. As this army stared down Earl and his 7 men, Earl, who had been told waving leaves was a universal sign of friendship, did just that. For hours, he waved leaves with no result before giving up. Much like the survivors, a peace was started with each group beckoning the other to join them. But both sides refused to move, and when the sun set, they would both make fires. With the fires burning, suspicion on both sides faded, and soon they became acquainted. The tribesmen wore only gauds covering their genitals and seemed enamored by the troops' clothing. This extended to hugging and patting the troops' bodies for hours. Unaware it was the clothes they were curious about, Earl came to the conclusion these men, for whatever reason, thought they were women. His solution to this problem was to pull off his pants, reveal his penis, and order his men to do the same. They would spend the next few hours tending to their fire naked, and Earl would show the natives a picture of his wife to once again reinforce that he was a man. In Earl's mind, this plan had been a success because the natives had finally stopped touching him. But a recount from another Logo Maple boy present at the time would reveal something much different. He would tell translators, once they were close enough to see the men were not covered in mud, they were fascinated by what they viewed as a second soft layer of skin the men could remove. What is more humorous than Earl's actions is that the Dani people covered their genitals by the age of 4 and took their gauds off only in the most private moments. To them, Earl and his troops were making a spectacle of themselves by exposing their genitals. Stories of these strange creatures waving around their genitals would quickly spread to distant villages, causing an influx of people arriving the next day to see what the fuss was about. But unfortunately for these people, this would be the last time they exposed themselves, and those who had travelled to see the men were left disappointed. But the story of the naked soldiers would provide laughs for years after the event. Though the tribe was friendly, Earl ordered scouts around the area and set up a guard for their first night among them. On their first day, Earl and his 5 men scouted around the valley, stumbling upon a decomposing body next to a spear, and further on the trail, a small abandoned village. In the mid-afternoon at their camp, another set of onlookers would arrive from a different region, and in response, the troops would fire their gun into the air to scatter the crowd. However, Earl didn't believe the natives understood how their weapons killed, and were only frightened by the strange sounds it made. This reasoning would prove correct when, close to 60 years later, an old man, who was a boy at the time, would state their fear at first was because of the unknown sound, but later, after seeing it used to kill a duck, understood its effects. Firing at the tribes for getting too close happened a few more times, but any offense the Logo Maple tribe may have taken was dismissed by something Earl didn't even know he was doing. While Earl and his men were camped out in the no man's land between the two warring tribes, his scouting trips were taking him to the edges of the Logo Maple's enemy tribe's territory. They saw this as Earl protecting them and actively taking guard of the area to ward off their enemies. By Tuesday 22nd, Earl and 5 of his men departed from their base camp with the assistance of some of the Logo Maple tribesmen and trekked through the rainforest towards the survivors. With each passing village, they would need to stop to satisfy the curiosity of the people within it, and their guides, not willing to venture out far from their villages, would be replaced. Though Earl and his men had become annoyed with being poked and prodded by the natives at each village, it was better than having their spears buried into their chest, and Earl began to trust the villagers as friendly. What Earl didn't know was he was just extremely lucky. There wasn't any hostility because the Uwambo people, who had come into contact with the survivors of the Gremlin crash, had put together what they call a maga. This was a declaration stating no one should kill the spirits because they were not human. Though not everyone agreed, and at any moment, any leader had at least 100 men at his disposal to ambush the paratroopers, many were frightened by the men's skin color and did not know what to think, having never seen a white person before. Frightened or not, it did not stop many villagers from confronting the men if they got too close to the wrong village, and their guides did not always prove useful either. At times, either not understanding where they wanted to go, or not willing to take them there. On their second day heading towards the crash site, they spent hours walking, only to find themselves back at their camp by the end of the day. But by the 25th, they would finally reach the campsite. Even with the delays in them reaching the survivors, Margaret and Kenneth still needed more time for their wounds to heal, and there was one other matter they needed to take care of. A supply drop would provide them with 21 silver dog tags and grave markers, and on Sunday, May 27th, Earl and his paratroopers would attempt to recover and bury the bodies of the fallen. Earl would write about this in his journal, stating, "Most of the bodies had been completely cremated by the intense heat of the fire. All of us had to use gas masks as the odor was terrific. Also, the bodies were almost a month old. After the burials were completed, I took some camera shots of the wrecks and graves. God only knows how anyone got out of the plane alive." The Uwambo people who cremated their dead watched as these creatures they didn't believe to be human buried their dead and left strange religious grave markings behind them. 33 days after the crash, the survivors would be given the go-ahead to travel home. For the month they had been there, every offer of food to the natives had been denied, but when John offered his machete as a parting gift, Wimiak accepted and now had the first metal weapon the tribe had ever come into contact with. The group would then trek back to the base camp, where Earl would be happy to see the natives he had first come into contact with before his departure. But something had changed. The villagers were less friendly than they were before. For many nights during their travels, they had neglected a guard duty, feeling relatively safe with the villagers around them. But feeling the tension in the air, Earl ordered his troops to keep guard overnight. This would prove to be the right move. Their presence had once again disturbed the villagers' lives, and their camp, still in the middle of the no man's land, was stalling their war. The local leaders of the surrounding village had grown tired of the men in the camp wandering where they pleased and firing their guns. In particular, the leader Yali Logo had been plotting against them. Yali visited the camp during the day, but at night sent a messenger to speak with his enemy Kurulu across the no man's land, asking for help in driving this group out. The Kurulu tribe would refuse to help, with some Dani who were present at the time stating they believed their enemies were more than happy to sit back and watch the soldiers undermine Yali's authority. But while Yali was plotting to get rid of the group was praying to be taken home. Luckily for all involved, the group would receive a message on the two-way radio. Rescue was coming. Their plan was to tow an engineless glider plane behind a C-47 aircraft and land it near the survivors. The C-47 would then fly 6 meters above the ground and deploy a steel hook which would catch a hold of a loop attached to the plane and pull it back into the sky. When the glider first dropped, the villagers rushed out and caught their first close-up look at what had been flying over them. They would even help push the plane into the right position for retrieval, and when the steel hook made contact with the loop, it pulled the plane up with neck-breaking force. The whole event was a risk and a terrifying operation for someone who had survived a plane crash a month prior. But despite the difficulties, it was a success, and for the people of the island country, the legends of spirits bringing the end to an era were largely correct. This area would develop high rates of AIDS, tourism would see tribes displaying their mummified dead for a price, and the once proud warriors were destined to wander the streets taking photos with tourists for money. It's hard to blame the Gremlins crash for these results, but it's an eerie prophecy all the same.